Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to the new year and to this week's episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig Van Sant. I teach at UNI, the University of Northern Iowa, and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. The show that we're going to do today, Ethical Issues of 2016, is somewhat different than our normal shows, that we pick a specific topic and discuss that. Today we have gathered a panel of experts and asked them to discuss and forecast what they see as the most important ethical issues of the coming year. With us today we have Todd Dorman, columnist with the Gazette. Todd, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
We also have Ben Rogers, chair of the Lynn County Board of Supervisors. Ben, appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
And our third panelist is Amer, the Associate Professor of Economics at Mount Mercy University. It's good to have you back on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to name and give a brief description of what each person sees as the most important ethical issue of 2016. We'll then, depending on what they say, decide which one to talk about and explore that issue and then move on to another issue. So Todd, let me start with you. What do you see as the essential ethical issue of 2016?
Well, it's an election year, and so I think, having watched 2015, I think it's sort of the decline of honesty and verifiable truth as currency in politics. I mean, we're probably living in a time where there's more fact-checking being done than ever before, and yet it seems candidates running for office, especially for president, don't seem to be bound. They're bound more by what their supporters want to hear than by telling us what's actually happening.
Okay, obviously an interesting topic to talk about. Ben, what do you think?
This was an interesting exercise to try and think about the issue, and so for me, it's really an extension of some of the issues that were, or the issue that was important to me in 2015, and that really was the proliferation of firearms and firearms-related crimes. And so in 2016, with a presidential election, I think that this issue will be as important as it was in 2015, and is an issue that as Americans and as individuals, we really have to, I think, get figured out. Okay,
thank you. Ayman, what's your topic?
I'm divided between two areas, and one of them is national and one of them is international. The national one, which I think people will talk about a lot, is the campaign issues. How is our political system? Is it effective? Is it too much imposed? The money imposes a lot on our system or not? The other issue, I think it will impose itself on us, which is the area of the Middle East and terrorism and the refugees. This is a big problem, but I think it has a habit of once in a while it will come back to be the topic.
Sure. Well, since two of you mentioned politics, lack of honesty in politics, the presidential election, and the influence of money, let's start with that. Todd, tell me a little bit more about why you think that is the issue to discuss.
Well, I mean, right now, especially on the Republican side in the caucus campaign that we're seeing sort of unfold and wind down in its final few weeks. I mean, we've seen a presidential race where the front runner, Donald Trump, has said a lot of things and made a lot of promises to do things that constitutionally, politically aren't possible. And yet, each time he says something outlandish, each time he says something that is easily verified by fact checkers as untrue. In fact, I think he's set the record for pants on fire for the Washington Post fact check. I mean, I think only like 7% of the things he said on the campaign trail, I think that's right, have been proven true. His poll numbers go up. So apparently, voters are looking for what he's saying, and even though what he's saying can be easily shown to be untrue, that's a big change. I mean, there was a time when a politician said something that was just patently false, would be called out by, on it by either his opponents or the media or someone, and he or she would have to retract that and say, well, I was wrong, here's what I meant. I didn't, that rule doesn't seem to work anymore. It's easy to see when things are untrue, but as long as your supporters want to hear it,
Okay.
you don't have to stop saying it. You can keep saying it over and over again.
Well, Ayman, let me ask you, do you see that the influence of money in politics is related to what Todd is saying?
Yes, I think very much, and I think the public is realizing that. And I think it's on both sides, on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, that people are looking for a person who is speaking their mind, coming from outside of the establishment of the party. That is true on both cases, in both parties. And people have realized, a lot of people have lost confidence in the system because it has been influenced by money for a long time. So they want somebody who is an outsider. And it looks like a large majority, not majority, but a large number of people on both ends are looking for, as you said, honesty, a person who is sincere, real, not just saying what they are saying.
Okay. Ben, I want to get you involved in the conversation,
Sure.
but I do want to ask Todd something about that. You specifically mentioned Donald Trump, and my understanding is that much of his campaign to this point has been self-financed.
Right.
Which means that it's not other people contributing. How does that play out, or
I
how
think
does that influence?
it's part of his appeal. I mean, there's a feeling out there, would I rather vote for a billionaire or vote for someone who's basically owned by a billionaire, or owned by a series of billionaires, or several, or the super PACs run by billionaires? And I think some people have concluded I would rather just have the billionaire. So I do think his sort of ability to say, I'm not bought and sold, by anyone. I'm my own person, even if that person is scary to other segments of the electorate.
Sure. Ben, you're an elected official.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be interested in your perspective on this issue. Is there, maybe it's different in presidential politics than it is in more local politics, but do you, when you're campaigning for re-election, do you feel a need to be honest and stick to the truth? That's
Well,
a terrible question for an elected official.
But I think when you are in an elected office that is closest to the people, whether it's city council, whether it's a county board, a state legislature to a certain extent, honesty and trustworthiness are your currency. If you don't have it, the voters will not reelect you. And it's a lot easier for them to call you out on it. It's a lot easier for people to challenge your beliefs and assumptions and the use of facts when you are representing at the local level. Money doesn't really play as much of a role as it does, let's say, in Congress, where congressional candidates and/or an incumbent is spending hours a day, every day, making phone calls because they have to raise a certain amount to even be considered a viable candidate. Even if they have great ideas, if they don't have money, they're not going to be able to afford the media to get their message out, et cetera. And so what you do see on the national level is how money has completely changed the game. And that candidates now will say one thing, and then their super PAC, even though they're not really legally or technically allowed to coordinate, will also broadcast a message maybe that the candidate doesn't want. So you now are getting hit from many, many different sides. The candidate side, people who support them, their opponents, the super PACs of the opponents who oppose that person, and it is really, I think, muddy the waters in terms of really allowing people to make an informed decision on a candidate.
Okay. Thank you. I I realized after I asked you that question that that was a terrible question. So I appreciate your honesty in answering it. Sticking with the political issue, why is it an ethical issue? We are looking at ethical issues for 2016. What about this is ethical as opposed to simply political or legal? Open that up to anybody.
Well, I mean, I think there's always an ethical component in basically making proposals as you run for election, introducing plans that, you know, actually have a basis somehow in reality.
In fact,
in reality. Like, you know, building a wall and making the Mexicans pay for it. I don't know that continually proposing that in front of crowds of people, telling them and promising that you're going to do that is necessarily ethical, considering that anyone who's, you know, studied civics beyond the 5th grade knows that the president can't just order walls built in other countries to pay for them. I mean, that's sort of, and also it's just, you know, just the basic good old, you know, when I'm talking about my opponent, do I characterize things that he's done in a truthful manner, or do I say that, you know, he's destroying the country or he will destroy the country, which is a lot of the rhetoric that you hear right now, on both, you know, Democrats and Republicans. I mean, Bernie Sanders' rhetoric about the oligarchs and the folks that he's targeting is pretty harsh also. And so, I mean, there's an ethical component to that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Democrats and Bernie Sanders. I didn't want this to be a
Sure.
one-sided issue. But from what you're saying, this encompasses both political parties.
Well,
not
there's
just one.
both political parties right now, and we had polls coming out this week that showed Bernie Sanders ahead in both Iowa and New Hampshire. So those emotional, very sort of strong emotional arguments on the Republican side by Donald Trump and to some extent Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders on the other side seem to be what people want to hear, regardless of the gaps in how you accomplish all of the things that are being promised.
Okay.
I would like to add that it is more a moral issue because we are electing our representatives in government. And so they are our agents, something of like a kind of that you have a lawyer and the lawyer speaks for you and advocate for you. So now we have important issues coming, healthcare, labor laws, environment, all kinds of very serious issues. And we trust those elected people to represent our interest. And what is happening, it seems, that they are being pressured by other powers in making this legislation that has to do with our healthcare and the air that we breathe and the water we drink and our education and everything else. And so therefore, it is not our vote that in the end that pressures them into making a decision or not. It is some other powers that as long as we did the vote and the vote is done, some other troops will move in and pressure them into taking a different direction from the one that would be in the public's interest.
Okay. Ben, again, I'm going to put you on the spot. How do we get better at this? How do we improve this situation?
Well, I think that fundamentally there has to be changes, obviously, with the Citizens United rule that allows virtually an unlimited amount of money to be spent by individuals on these races. I think we need to look at what other democracies are doing. We're probably the only democracy that spends 2 to 3 years trying to elect a president who spends multi-billions on both sides. In Great Britain, when the Prime Minister dissolves Parliament, an election is called within 90 days, and there's only a certain amount that they can spend on advertising for TV. And if you can't get your message across in 90 days, then there's probably an issue with your message. And so certainly looking at how we structure our elections so that it's not the minute you take office is the minute that you're worried about re-election. And that oftentimes is what, certainly on the national level, is happening.
But you're going to take money out of the pockets of all the pizza ranch owners across Iowa that get people to come there for 2 years.
Very true. Ayman, you brought up the idea of voting and the lack of influence that actual voting has on that. One of the things that I was thinking about as a major ethical issue for 2016 is voting. I talked with my adult children over Christmas, 2 out of 3 whom said they planned not to vote. And it's Christmas, I didn't want to be really ugly to them, but we had a serious discussion about voting. Any ideas on how to get more people to vote, whether it's actually an ethical issue itself?
Well, and it ties into what we were just talking about with the money, because a lot of times what the consultant strategy is with all of that money is to sort of drive your base of voters to the polls and sort of I forget the word, sort of alienate your opponent's voters, and then also sort of alienate anybody in the middle that's not terribly interested. And so, I mean, from that strategy, if your people show up and you win by 1 vote, it's a success. So you are kind of encouraging people that aren't already part of your base of support to sort of pox on the process.
Okay.
I would say a big chunk of it is that people feel not represented, that this system does not represent their interest. That's why they don't vote. So I had the same discussion with my children, and they would say, it wouldn't make any difference. Well, that's what it's not supposed to. It's supposed to make a difference. And if we have 30 or 40% only of people go to the November elections, that means 60 or 70% of people have no participation whatsoever and have no power whatsoever in the system. So it's kind of catch-22. They have to recognize that this country belongs to them, and that's their role to put their vote for the ones they trust. On the other hand, the system so far has shown that it is not representative of their interests.
Okay.
And it's not just president. It's not just the really exciting elections that people should vote for or turn out for, or that your children should. It's the school board elections that only a handful of people ever decide to show up for, and they have a lot of control over what your children learn. The budget of the school districts. There's low turnouts for other elections, and it really is one of the important prices that you pay for citizenship is to show up and to vote, even when you don't think it makes a difference. If you don't think it makes a difference, there's a bunch of people in Florida in the year 2000 that would probably argue otherwise, or in Minnesota where a governor's election was decided by just a handful of voters. So if you don't think it doesn't count, it does, and certainly even paying attention to the school board issues and other ballot issues are equally as important.
Sure.
In fact, in a democratic system, I would just add that it should be the only thing that matters, your vote, not the money at all. It is just what you write in that piece of paper.
And you hear people lament turnout, yet we have our elections on a Tuesday instead of a Saturday, or we don't make it a holiday like some other countries do. And I mean, there are a lot of ideas out there for increasing participation and making it easier, but it seems like in recent years we've mostly heard about ways to, put up some safeguards and things that some people would argue would have made it more difficult.
It would make it.
Right.
I thought about that. I said, every time, it's a Tuesday. And I said to myself, why is this always a Tuesday? Why is it not a Saturday or a Sunday? I think it has to do, I don't know, I hope that is not intended, intended to reduce the number of participants. So,
Well, as Todd says, I'm afraid that seems to be the tendency these days. Let me move on to another topic. We've talked a lot about the political system. Ben, you mentioned firearms and that being a major ethical issue. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this one I struggled over again with, there's a lot of other issues that I think will take up a lot of bandwidth in 2016, but I'm afraid that no matter whom the president is when that person is sworn into office, there's going to be many more press conferences with the president behind the podium talking about another shooting somewhere in a community that we may have not heard of or a community close to us. And it's become so troubling, but because it's become so routine. And I think it's one of those issues that as Americans, we hold that right very close to our chest. And like a lot of other issues that are social issues, people move immediately to their camps. You're either on one side or the other, and you forsake any kind of middle ground compromise. And that understanding that no one is coming to take your guns away. It's just logistically impossible, and that's not going to happen. But finding common sense ways to address a right that Americans have to make sure that we don't see these kind of shootings or the proliferation of violence that we're seeing in cities like Chicago.
Well, I read a terrifying report recently that said that if you count mass shootings as, I forget whether the article said 3 or 4 deaths or more at a single time, that there were more than one mass shooting per day in the United States in 2015. I mean, we remember the Sandy Hooks and, the Oregons and places like that. But this is happening on a daily basis everywhere in the United States. Talk a little bit about what seems to be a plain reason why this is an ethical issue, again, as opposed to a rights issue or legal.
Well, it's an ethical issue because it affects every and any American, and we need to look at the rights in which we have, but how can they be looked at and enforced differently? How can we, as a nation, understand that we also have a right to live safely? And as an ethical issue, how you apply ethics to a constitutional right, I think, could be challenging. But when you take the countries of Great Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, Australia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, you add those up, that roughly equates the population of the United States. And their total gun deaths per year are less than several hundred, and ours are over 30,000. So we have to ask ourselves, as Americans, are we more homicidal by nature, or is it the fact that we just have a proliferation of weapons out there and not a really good method to enforce how they're being used or how they're being obtained?
Well, that actually brings up an interesting question that I hadn't thought about. Are we more homicidal than other nations' peoples, or is it just guns?
Yes, I think a lot of it is guns, because we have availability of the guns. I mean, all of these other nations that Ben talked about don't have availability of guns. They don't allow people to have guns. So the question is it ethical, is it constitutional? Yes, it depends on the original intention of the people who wrote that right into the Constitution. Is it because of what? Of hunting? Or is it because we want to be able to rebel against the government? Or what other reasons? And why are these other systems that are still democratic are fine without people thinking that we have to rebel against the government? I'm saying we have to determine for ourselves as a nation what is the grounds for that right. What is it for? Is it, then after that, I think we can decide what direction should we take.
Well, let me play the teacher and ask you what your idea is. Why do we have that right?
I think we have that right because at the time of the Constitution, it may have been a different context. At this time, you walk in Paris or London or Frankfurt or Toronto, and people don't have a right to carry a gun or have a gun or own a gun. And these are modern cities, cosmopolitan areas. They are functioning fine. So I don't know why do we think that it is necessary for our system to be sustained to have guns. So I think primarily the answer is yes, because of the availability of guns.
Okay. Todd, let me put you on the spot for a moment. With the alienation between the gun control advocates and the guns rights advocates, do you see much hope for progress in this area?
No, and I mean, frankly, and I'm always kind of torn on this issue. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and I hunted a lot, and all of my friends did, and lots of people in our town, you know, had guns. Kids carried them in their pickup trucks and trunks to school. I mean, that was not unusual. There wasn't any gun violence. But, you know, what I don't understand is, you know, we saw guns as a tool that had a purpose. Mm-hmm. And I guess from that perspective, I don't understand sort of the politicization of guns as sort of a political symbol, amassing stockpiles of weapons, being able to purchase weapons that really don't have much of a purpose as a real tool, other than to kill a lot of people. I guess that's where I break. I think I have sympathy for the argument that law-abiding people should be able to own firearms as long as they, know how to use them and take care of them. But this idea that I need to, carry my weapon out in the open as a political statement, like I'm wearing a campaign button to show everybody what my political persuasion is and things like that, I just have a hard time understanding it.
Sure. We are running out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time to discuss more issues. Ayman, what would you like to leave our viewers with? What idea should they take with them?
If I can, I would go back to my first answer of the first question. I would say that the U.S. Role in the world cannot be ignored, and we cannot pull back and be isolationist. And the world will come to us if we did not go. That means not necessarily militarily, but we have to be involved in protecting people's rights and freedoms everywhere.
Okay, good. We have about a minute left. Ben?
I would leave people with the saying that decisions are made by those who show up. And so as we've spoken about elections, it's important for them to make their voice heard and vote for candidates on the merits of the issue and not on the ads that they've been seeing.
Thank you. Todd?
I guess I would urge people to not sort of get stuck in the mindset that your side of the political spectrum is always right and the other side is always wrong. Maybe step over to the other side to listen to them once in a while. Maybe read some stuff you wouldn't normally read. I try to do that, and it's helpful. It's tough in this day and age.
Sometimes painful.
Things are very polarized right now, but if
Yes.
people could just sort of reach out, maybe that would, in small ways, help.
Thank you. I would also, because of my interest in voting as a political issue, encourage you, as Ben did, to exercise your right to vote in the coming year and do what you can to make this a better place to live. On behalf of the Interreligious Council of Linn County, I want to thank all of you for tuning in this week. I want to thank all of you panelists for providing some really good food for thought and an enjoyable conversation. Thank you very much. Have a good week.